What's going on? Thanks for joining me. I wanted to make this video for those of you who own the Subaru Ascent or are thinking about the Subaru Ascent. And basically, I wanted to share information that may someday save your transmission. So if you didn't know, the Subaru Ascent has the same transmission as the WRX, the automatic WRX, a car and transmission that I've talked a lot about on my channel. And those of us who own the automatic WRX have been, over the years, trying to modify that car and adding power to it, and in the process trying to make the transmission last. That's typically been the single point of failure in these cars, the CVT transmission in these cars. So we're trying to add power to them and at the same time keeping the transmission healthy. That's been an adventure, to say the least, but we did learn a couple lessons. So in this video, I wanted to share with you those lessons that we learned, how you can read your transmission temperature in the Subaru Ascent, and how you can protect yourself possibly in the future. Let's get to it. First of all, the transmission that's in the Subaru Ascent is the same one, as I said, in the WRX. One of the big problems that was happening in those cars is premature failure of the transmission, partly due to heat. So we were pushing these cars and overheating that transmission for extended periods of time, and eventually that leads to all sorts of problems. In order to make our transmission last, we started adding CVT coolers to it and monitoring that temperature, the CVT temperature, and we have seen some success in doing that. There are some lessons that we learned. Why is it such a big deal with a CVT transmission, right? Whether in the WRX or in the Ascent. We all know that heat, of course, is bad for any transmission, but why is this especially important to mind your CVT temperature in the Ascent or the WRX? Part of the reason is because nobody knows how to fix these transmissions. So for the most part, the transmission is the item that gets replaced if something fails. Very few shops know how to fix components within it. So if you found yourself in a situation where your transmission went, say, out of warranty, then it would be a tall order to find a shop that can replace the transmission or repair the transmission at a reasonable cost. So typically what's been happening is that Subaru dealers have to do the work. And of course, if Subaru dealers are doing the work, then it costs a lot of money, some upwards of $8,000 to $10,000. That's a lot of money. Rather than just being able to buy a new transmission and having a local shop do it for a fraction of the cost, you're stuck having to go through Subaru. So if you have to do that outside of warranty, you'll be stuck paying that high payment. So in order to avoid that to begin with, what we have to do is make sure that we're treating the transmission and treating the car in a way that is conducive to its longevity, right? Unfortunately, these cars don't have the ability to read the transmission temperature like you can the oil temperature, like you can the coolant temperature. The transmission temperature readout is just not there. It will tell you if you overheat the transmission, but it won't tell you what the transmission temperature is. What I'm trying to get at here is that it's incumbent upon you, if you own the car, to monitor the temperatures based on how you drive the car and based on your geographic location. And if you find yourself in a situation where you constantly see very high temperatures in the CVT fluid, well, maybe you can do something to mitigate those high temperatures. What does the car do to do that to begin with? There are two safety mechanisms built into the transmission, right? The CVT fluid has a lot of functions in the car. So it has to lubricate, it has to serve as hydraulic fluid. It also has to allow friction between the pulleys and the belt. And that's a very big distinction for the CVTs versus traditional transmissions. So that's a tall order for any fluid. So in order to perform those functions, it has to be a very specific type of fluid designed to operate at a very specific temperature. So, and that temperature is somewhere around 170 degrees or so. So that's the ideal CVT fluid temperature. So let me show you something. Right here, you can see the CVT warmer, right? This device right here has CVT fluid running through it, and it also has coolant running through it. Of course, the fluids inside of it don't mix, but it's basically a heat exchanger. So the heat from the coolant heats up the transmission fluid so that if you live in a cold area in the mornings, your transmission heats up faster, right? This is necessary for the drivability of the car, and it's also necessary for fuel economy. So because the transmission is not undergoing internal combustion like the engine is, the fluids that run through the engine get hotter much faster than the transmission fluid. And that's why the car uses that heat exchanger right there in order to use some of that heat of the coolant to heat up the transmission fluid. So that's how it gets the transmission fluid to temperature faster. But that doesn't do anything on the other end of the spectrum. That doesn't do anything for overheating the transmission fluid. For that, you have this CVT cooler right here. And this is basically a radiator core that has CVT fluid running through it. And it runs through these lines right here. It goes through the core and right back into the transmission. Of course, as you're driving, a wall of air hits that core and it cools down the fluid going through there, and then that fluid goes back cooler into the transmission, and that's how the car keeps the transmission fluid in check. Now, it could be that this is perfectly adequate for the Ascent for most people, and I think it will be. So based on my experience and having monitored that fluid in my own car, mine hovers at around 165, 170 for this time of year. But see, that's most of the time driving by myself or just a few people in the Ascent. If you happen to have a fully loaded Ascent, say 8 passengers, you have some cargo, and maybe you're hauling a 3,000 pound boat and you live in Arizona, your situation's probably gonna be way different. And it would behoove you to check your transmission temperature in that case to see if you are on a daily basis exceeding those temperatures. So you might ask what temperatures are not good, right? If you're at around 170 to 180 or so, it's fine. And if you dip into higher temperatures around 200 occasionally, or even a little bit more, that's probably okay. It'll become a problem if you're doing it over time, because then you start deteriorating the transmission fluid, you start breaking it down, and it stops being able to do its job. It won't lubricate properly. Your seals may start breaking down, and you can start having fluid seepage. Over time, if you have fluid seepage, you might lose enough fluid to have a catastrophic failure of the CVT. And of course, you can have any other sorts of issues related to heat. I don't want to sound alarmist, don't get me wrong. Again, this is informational so that you can check to see if you might benefit from reading the transmission temperature in your own car. I think if you drive the car modestly, like most people probably will drive the Ascent, since it is a family vehicle, and you're not towing anything, and you don't necessarily live in a place that has a really hot temperature most of the time, you're probably going to be just fine. However, if you do live in one of those areas that are really hot and you are towing, or you have a lot of cargo in your Ascent, then it definitely might be worth checking into that. So what's the point of checking into it if you can't do anything about it? Well, you can do something about it. If you're constantly hitting high temperatures and you discover that the CVT cooler is just not enough, then you could relatively easily go in there and replace that radiator core with a bigger one that has more surface area to provide more cooling. You can also go in there and add another core in series so that you effectively have 2 cores and you double your cooling effect. So these are things that you could relatively easily do even on your own. Now, I have a video where I installed a CVT cooler in my WRX. I'll link up above so you can check it out if you want to see what kind of work is involved in that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not asking anybody to go out there and start doing this into their brand new car, especially if it's under warranty, because that's a big consideration. If you have your car under warranty, this is not a car that you're going to modify like the WRX. There's really not that drive to jeopardize your warranty for this cost, because after all, if your transmission goes under warranty, Subaru is going to fix it at no cost to you. But if you happen to only have, say, a 36,000 mile warranty and you just cross that line, the car's no longer under warranty, then it might be beneficial to you to start checking those temperatures and maybe augment that stock CVT cooler with something better. Because if you blow your transmission after your warranty expires, it would be a very expensive bill. So you might wonder how you can read the transmission temperature, right? I have a whole video showing how to do that. It's an older video that I did for the WRX, and it shows you exactly the things that you need in order to read the transmission temperature and the process to get that done. I don't want to reinvent the wheel and show you all that here, so I'm just going to link up above to that video so you can check it out. Just disregard the talk about the WRX, because obviously it's not the WRX that you're interested in, but the process is the same. So you would need the OBD link LX. I'll also link in this video description so you can take a look. It's relatively cheap, and it's an OBD reader that has a lot of uses beyond just checking the transmission temperature, and it's worth getting for its own sake. You can use it on any vehicle, and you can combine it with apps like Torque Pro to get a lot of information on any vehicle that the car doesn't show you. It's worth getting for its own sake, let alone to read the transmission temperature. So check that video out for more information. I'll link to it and a card up above, and also in the video description. I'll also link to a video that I did discussing the importance of a CVT cooler in the WRX and the whole process. And there's a lot of information that I cover in that video that applies to the Ascent also, if you're interested in knowing a little bit more in-depth information on the transmission that's in your Ascent. Even though it is the same transmission that is in the WRX, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% the same transmission. Of course, things within it might be different that make it more suitable for a heavy vehicle like the Ascent. The Ascent is, 1,000 pounds heavier than the WRX, and it's meant to haul 7 or 8 passengers. It's also capable of towing up to 5,000 pounds. So it's a whole different animal. So the CVT can have internal modifications that make it more suitable for this vehicle, like an upgraded torque converter and other internal modifications that may make it stronger and more suitable for this platform. So I would imagine that in the Ascent, they're not just going to throw a transmission that's not suitable for a heavy car like this. So I hope you got something out of this video. I'm going to continue putting out content on the WRX and on the Subaru Ascent and other general automotive content. So please consider subscribing for more videos just like this. And if the video was useful, give it a like. I'll see you next video. Take care.